I'm a Kanye fan. As you can see, I have Kanye West Yeezus on tape, College Dropout on vinyl. And so I'd consider myself a fan of Kanye. And so I was looking forward to this documentary, and I would say that I was definitely fulfilled. This is a Kanye West documentary directed by Cudi and Chike, and it basically follows Kanye West over the span of basically 20 years. The whole documentary is essentially a Kanye West origin story, and it also just shows the process that Kanye went through just being able to release his College Dropout record. And then also, it also just explores Kanye West nowadays. And so this documentary is split up into three parts: vision, purpose, and awakening. Overall, I enjoyed the whole show, or I guess the whole documentary. It was interesting to see Kanye's life before he was like this big egocentric man guy. Part one is essentially just him before he even gets signed by any record labels. He has like a bunch of tracks, he has an idea for an album, and he basically just wants to get signed first in order to actually get like money to finish the album. And so part one, or act one, is basically just him talking about how like his whole life he's been seen as a producer, or he's been seen making beats, but his whole life he's been rapping. He's been this person who identifies as basically a rapper. Or in this episode, he's basically showing off his skills. He's showing off to people that like he actually has potential. And so that's basically the whole episode, or the whole movie, is him trying to essentially get signed by Rockefeller. And so it was interesting to see just Kanye at such a grounded, realistic, and just a more calm and tame and charismatic Kanye. Basically, very similar to the Kanye we see in College Dropout. I was actually really enjoying sort of going into the world of hip hop, sort of seeing all the different people and how much it takes to actually get a record made, and sort of how homemade his whole album basically was. He basically did all the beats in his apartment, in his room, using his instruments and pianos, and he would just invite people over, like, yo, can you do this like quick verse on my thing? Like, it'll just be like really quick, and then they come over and they hang out. And we're watching him like make connections with people. We see him meet Jay-Z, and they basically are like just two entirely different levels. And it was interesting to see them interact and everything like that. And that was basically part one. Essentially, he has a vision, and at the end, he finally gets signed, and he starts working on his album. The whole documentary is also focuses on Cudi and Kanye's relationship, and so the whole documentary is sort of from the perspective of Cudi. He's basically telling the story of Kanye from his perspective, from what he's experienced and his relationship of it. And so it was interesting because you get like you see basically a friendship develop. You're not seeing just Kanye, you're seeing a friendship between Kanye and Cudi. And so that was kind of interesting. But then also he has like kind of cringy voiceover that he puts in. He's like, before we get into Kanye's story, let me tell you about my life. Like that sort of thing. And it was a little cringe, but it's like, whatever. That's the idea of the story. These are the characters in the movie. And so it made sense that there was a person sort of narrating, guiding us through Kanye's journey, just so he can also just fill in the gaps a little bit of things that maybe we possibly missed, or maybe things that weren't entirely represented in the actual footage that we got. He could just kind of fill in the gaps a little bit through the voiceover, which was fine. I guess I would rate this part one like an 8.5 out of 10. Act two is purpose, and so this one focuses on Kanye actually trying to get the funding for the College Dropout, because essentially Rockefeller still don't really trust Kanye, and so we're kind of watching him sort of, he gets in an injury, the famous car crash where he can't even speak, and we see him make Through the Wire, and we also see his journey on making the Through the Wire music video in order to hopefully get people talking about his album, and then finally getting funding for it. We also see a Kanye that's just much more focused. Like now that he has the money, he's like, okay, I'm gonna like start working now. I'm actually gonna go for it. Even though he actually is part of the record label, he's still just very on the down low. He still like seemed like he's pushed back a little bit. And so we see him struggling to get even studio time. He doesn't even have the money to get studio time to actually finish mixing or finish recording. We also see some cool behind the scenes footage of him with like Jamie Foxx, seeing Jay-Z being featured on some of his tracks and stuff. It was cool for like this whole show, or these whole first two acts, to actually see like other rappers that exist in that time, and we see them like all interact with each other, and it was just cool to see the world of hip hop once again that was shown or started showing in the first act. We're actually seeing that much more in Act 2 and in Act 3 eventually. Yeah, we're basically watching Kanye as he's trying to just get more out there, actually try to finish the album, and eventually he does, and he gets famous because he wins the Grammy, and he has that famous speech where he says,
Everybody want to know what I would do if I didn't win. I guess we'll never know.
It was cool, I guess, to see him finally say to all the people, like, I did it, even though you guys said I barely could, or even though I broke my jaw, all that kind of stuff. This is when we actually start to see him sort of develop his villain arc, because we all know Kanye is this big man, crazy guy, and this is when we sort of start to see him develop in that sense. Because after he wins the Grammy, he's like, okay, I'm up high now. I'm a genius, basically. Act 2 ends as he wins his Grammy, and he's like, okay, I'm gonna keep going, and I'm gonna try to just make it even further as I could. And so the documentary, or Kuti, narrates that like this is just, he thought basically his documentary was basically over. But then he realizes that like there's actually a lot more that's going to happen in the story, which is what leads into Act 3. And so for Act 2, I'd give it an 8 out of 10. Not as much crazy stuff happens. It just more feels like a part 2 of Act 1. So it's like Act 1 and 2 are more like the actual documentary. But this leads into Act 3, which sort of, we see Kuti in a state where he doesn't really talk to Kanye as much anymore. Kanye at this point has released a whole another album, and he rarely gets to see Kanye or rarely gets to film him, because he's basically, at this point, he's been with Kanye ever since the start of his career, ever since before he even started rapping. He's been with him. And so now it's like the friendship is sort of just slowly spreading and falling apart a little bit. And so it was kind of sad to see that happening. And you felt a little bit bad for Kuti, but then he's like talking about how he's decided to start a family in the time that he had, and he was able to like care for his child and his wife and everything, but he's still kind of watching Kanye from afar. And then we get to the point where Kanye's mom, Donda, dies, and so basically Kanye is like, he's on tour while his mom dies, and people are like telling him like, don't do it. But he just continues. And so we're basically discovering what Kanye possibly felt like through how Kuti perceived Kanye. Basically, we don't actually understand Kanye's thoughts. We just see what he's possibly thinking through the perspective of Kuti. And so that basically means that we don't fully get a more in-depth look at Kanye, because at this point, the story more focuses on Kuti for like majority of Act 3. Until a certain part, or 2008, he basically finally just Kanye cuts Kuti off, doesn't see him until like 2014 or 2016, when he invites him back to like sort of film him on the Life of Pablo tour. And so this is the part where like some fans are kind of sad, because they didn't really get to see the journey of like the Yeezus tour or the My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy stuff or any of that. And some people are a little bit disappointed by that, and like I kind of want to see that too. But once again, I guess that's not really the point of the documentary. It's more of just like the state of mind that Kanye had throughout his journey and throughout his life. And so at this point, we see him at his lowest. He has, mental health issues. He has people making fun of him, all this crazy stuff. He's struggling. He's struggling because his music, like he's trying to continue to make music. At this point, like we're at the Kids See Ghosts era of Kanye's career, where he's with Kid Cudi, and they're in Tokyo making music, and it's awesome. It's really cool to see. It was really cool to see them working together, because basically Kanye finally eventually invites Kuti back, and he's like, yo, I want you to film me just doing all this other stuff that I'm going to be working on. It was cool because we actually got to see some cool eras of Kanye. Like we saw the Life of Pablo stuff, and then we got the Kids See Go stuff, and then we finally reached the Jesus is King part. Because at this point in Kanye's life, he's like a little crazy. He's got a lot of mental illness stuff going on, and he's addicted to drugs and crazy stuff, and he's been admitted to the hospital at that point. He is struggling a little bit, but then he decides to make a turn, like a point in his career. This wasn't like a major point, but it was a point where he's like, I gotta start thinking about what I can actually use my power for. Like he realizes that he has such a powerful voice that he's been using it for promoting some terrible behavior, when he could actually be promoting good, when he could actually be promoting a good lifestyle, or promoting health or love and strength and stuff like that. All right, he realizes basically he has to like turn to Jesus, and he basically becomes a Christian because he realizes that like he should be using his voice for good instead of promoting crazy, terrible lifestyles and stuff. And so he basically talks about how like people are thinking that, is this real, is this fake? But it seemed very genuine what Kanye was going through, his state of mind where he's like, he was struggling, but like he found God and like actually felt healed or felt overcome with his battles and stuff. And he was actually able making music again. He was producing. He's doing all this crazy stuff. It wasn't for the money, this whole Christian thing. He's definitely like actually trying to change his perspective and change his paths. And so that was interesting because at the end, it sort of ends on a note where Kanye is sort of just... We basically ended at the point where he's just about to release Donda. It sort of ends with a prayer from Kuti, kind of saying how he like prays for like peace and like strength and stuff, and like God's protection. And it was interesting because it's like sort of a point, because Kanye, he sort of finished his arc. He sort of realized what he can actually use his good for, or his voice for. And so Kuti points out the similarities between the new Kanye, or the Kanye we have right now, compared to the Kanye from the college dropout area. And he basically pointing out these similarities, that it basically came full circle back to the point where Kanye is Kanye again, and he can actually do the things that he wants to do finally, and he's him. But now we should just pray that that God will guide him and protect him for everything that's going on. And I was like, that's interesting. That's an interesting way of ending it. And that was basically the Kanye documentary. But it just, like, I guess I kind of felt like we could get just a little more. I wish there was, like, a more secure ending besides just the prayer. Like, maybe Kanye actually admitting something specifically. Because the whole point of the documentary is to dive into Kanye's brain. But we don't really get that, at least in part 3. We don't really get to see, like, what Kanye's actually thinking, or what he's trying to go through, or what he's challenging. Until, like, the Jesus is King portion. I've been talking so much, my mouth is so dry. I just wish we were able to see just a little more of what Kanye was actually feeling, and like that, see that change in his head much more clear. At the very, very end, I wish there was like something more conclusive besides the prayer, which the prayer was cool. I like that. And the ending shot was pretty interesting as well. But I'd say overall, this is a good documentary. We got to explore Kanye's life. We got to see the behind the scenes of some of his albums and the stuff he's going through, and the process of him dealing with some of the trauma that he's been experiencing in life, the life challenges, the car accident, the passing of his mom, the mental illness stuff, him finding Christianity. That all stuff was very well done. And so it was all kind of put together through Kuti's editing and also his voiceover, which I found a little bit to be a tiny bit cringy, but I got used to it, and it was normal at the end. And so we kind of needed his voiceover to even like actually end the movie, because the movie doesn't end with Kanye, it sort of ends with Kuti. It was cool, it was interesting, and it makes you think about Kanye's life in a different way. And you don't see him as much as this egocentric guy, as more just like a person who's just trying to actually use his voice for good. I wish we could see just a little more of the life, or some of like the Yeezus tour, or maybe even the My Beautiful Dark Fantasy stuff, but Kanye, or the documentarian Kuti, was physically not present, so we can't get any of that. So it's like, whatever. This is what we got, and I liked it. Anyways, that was it. Act 3, I would also give it an 8 out of 10, maybe upwards of an 8.5. But overall, I'd give the whole documentary an 8 to 8.5 out of 10. I liked what we got to experience, what we got to see, being in the emotions that Kanye felt. It was interesting to sort of be with him, and I appreciated that. And so I like this documentary, and I'd recommend it to you guys. Not a lot of people are watching it. Surprisingly, it's Kanye West, but I'd recommend it if you listen to him at all, or if you're interested in his life at all. If you're interested in just like his most recent life, you can watch Act 3, just Act 3. If you're interested in like how the College Dropout was released, just watch part 1 and part 2, or just watch the whole thing. I'd recommend the whole thing. And so hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. I recommend watching this documentary, and I'll see you guys next time.